Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Los Cedros Wash Processed Ecuador from Apollon's Gold. And there's the bag right there. And Apollon's Gold, based out of Tokyo, Japan. And they were a suggestion to us by Polar Bear, so shout out to and thank you to Polar Bear for the suggestion. This is our first ever full bag review of one of their coffees, as we had zero familiarity with them going into this review. However, I have heard quite a bit about this coffee roaster, as there are a number of people that consider them to be one of the best, if not the best, coffee roaster in Japan. And I have seen them featured pretty regularly on Dayglow's website, which is actually where we purchased this coffee. We've been monitoring Dayglow pretty regularly for a return of Apollon's Gold, as I know that they carry them pretty regularly, and I wanted to try a couple of their coffees since they've been on our list for a while. So looking forward to discussing them, as this right here is day 50. And recipe we went with for this coffee was similar to theirs, a little bit more concentrated. They have a 17:1 water to coffee ratio. We went 16:1, brewed at 97 degrees Celsius, which I believe translates to about 207 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, which of course indicates a more medium fine grind. Now, in terms of roast profile, I'd say by most metrics, a lot of people would consider this on the lighter side of coffees in general. It's definitely lighter than a lot of the previous coffees I've had from Japan, but even by a lot of American standards and European standards, this is just a lighter coffee in general. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea, just kind of lighter than typically experienced from Japanese coffees in my experience. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 33, first impression. It was a pretty clean cup from that first impression, as there were some slightly citric attributes with a subtle brightness that really does kind of skew in the citric direction. So I was kind of looking at this coffee from the outside and I said, okay, well, I see that we have a lot of citric flavor notes listed on here, a lot of maybe more tame fruit components to it. But at the end of the day, I really kind of expected that maybe with the profile, this coffee might just have some underrated brightness to it. It was a good start, but nothing that was specific to this cup, with the exception of maybe a slight herbal tea aspect to it. Day 35, another slightly moderate day, as the cup remains citric forward with a slightly floral sweet attribute to the cup. And it was on this day, it was the first time I had kind of gotten that floral sugar cookie, which I do experience from a lot of coffees, especially when they are on the lighter side of a roast profile. Grape felt a little bit more apt, as there's a slightly sweet berry aspect to it, but at the same time, cup still remaining a little bit more moderate. Better day, but we still had work to do, as on day 37, the cup was oddly savory, as it skewed a lot more in this tea-like direction without the same sort of vibrancy experienced earlier. A little bit of the brightness has been toned down for this slightly muted aspect, as this cup at times was a little tricky to kind of get right, because it did come off so tame. A lot of it was just really subtle, nothing that really stood out, especially from those earlier impressions. When it does cool off, it does have a slightly more citric, a slightly more savory aspect to it. So it was possibly an off day, as this one really did seem to have a lot more of that savory component to it. Day 39, a much better day, as the sweetness to the cup is pointed a little bit more in the citric direction. So the flavor notes they have listed on here are a lemon and a tangerine. And in this case, it was slightly more on the tangerine side, but even then it was kind of the more bright orange aspect. Lime is quite pronounced in the finish as well, and that's something that I kind of noted on this. It does have a little bit of a lemon lime. The citrus is really much more pronounced in the finish, especially with a fair bit of a cool down. Floral cookie sweetness present yet again, really kind of both complementary and in contrast to the citric components to it. It's better. I still felt that this coffee needed a little bit of work. Day 41, ran it through the April dripper, and that's something I might discuss a little bit more in future videos, as I've been experimenting ever so slightly with the April dripper, and it was a little bit better, as the earlier floral aspects were a little bit more present, a little bit more sweet, and there was a little bit more of the lively lemon, which isn't something I was necessarily going for, given that that was the most pronounced factor to this cup, and I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of brighter lemon attributes. I really maybe wanted that to be a little bit more toned down and get more of the sweet florality, but nonetheless, still a bit more of that kind of slightly herbal, earthy aspect, which did seem a little bit more in abundance. I think the April really did kind of accentuate some of the qualities in this cup. Not necessarily my favorite. Day 43, adjusted a little bit, and it did have some results, as for the most part I had kept the recipe a little bit on the lower side. I had gone really high on the temperatures. I had kept our standard recipe, but kind of keeping it in the middle at their 97 did seem to work best, as there was a little bit more of that slight floral cookie sweetness within it, encompassed by a little bit more of a moderate soft citrus. And as the cup cools down, it does really ramp up again, and I'm getting a little bit more of that listed grape. I usually don't experience a lot of grape in coffees to begin begin with, and having a little bit more of that in this cup did kind of set it apart, as I feel like it was more present in this than I typically experience. Day 45, a little bit more coarse on the grind. That's one more thing. I did have more success going a little bit more coarse with this one. And there was a slightly different citric aspect to it, which did feel a little bit more sweet. And at this time, the kind of tangerine-like aspect was a little bit more pronounced, I think maybe with a little bit more time, because here we are already on day 45, which is 6 weeks into this coffee. And it's starting to get a little better because I feel like it's toning down a little bit on those bright citric aspects. Lasting finish in the cup with a slight florality. Again, subtle, but more present than I was experiencing on earlier days. Day 48, final notes we have, and it's the best day of the coffee to this point, as I feel like from this point going forward, it might still continue to get slightly better, but throughout these notes, the coffee has never taken a huge jump or a leap forward. It's remained pretty consistent in what you're experiencing, as the more concentrated recipe really was felt because since the cup was too slight and subtle to begin with, I really needed to kind of concentrate to maybe get a little bit more from it. Again, continuing to open up as it does cool down, a lot more in the citric direction. There's a slight grainy component to it, while the grape attribute is definitely a little bit more slight and pronounced, a background characteristic, but more pronounced than I typically experience yet again. Best most distinguishing factor in this cup was at times it kind of tasted like a yuzu gummy to me, which is a very interesting and specific note, but that's kind of the best I was able to get from it and the point I felt was worth highlighting the most. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And for level 4, so let's go through those real quick. The cleanliness level 4, it's still a clean cup of coffee. There's no questioning that. Even if it isn't pointed in a specific direction, it does have plenty of clarity to it, even if it is also skewing a little bit more on that citric side of things. Finish, level 4. Interestingly, at the warmer temperatures, it has a very quick finish. But then as the cup does cool down, this is pretty much just slightly above room temperature. And at this point, the citric attribute really does shine at the end. It does have a little bit more of a lasting finish. So while at warmer temperatures it's a 3, it's definitely more justified at that 4 at this time, and kind of on the higher side of the level 4 too. Acidity, level 4, it does have a really bright acidity to it, and I think I've mentioned before plenty of times, not necessarily my favorite component in coffees as a whole, so the acidity, I mean, I could take it or leave it, not my favorite part of this coffee. And then the citrus fruit at a level 4, it's the note I've highlighted the most. And I know that they're going for it in 2 directions, the lemon and then the tangerine. I wish I was able to get more of that tangerine, a little bit more of that sweetness, but it was kind of more of that lemon, interestingly, yuzu sweetness and citric component I was getting from it. A bunch of level 3s. So we'll start with the body, because I think the body is really worth mentioning, because this is a little bit more heavy body than I would think I was expecting. This is a South American coffee, so that could be a lot of the reasoning behind that. I'm going to hold off on the sweetness because the florality level 3, that for me was the second most dominant factor, and that's why I'm surprised they don't have a floral note listed on here, but I feel like it's something I experience maybe a little different to a lot of people with a lot of these lighter profiled coffees, is that kind of floral cookie-like sweetness. Bitterness level 3, that's right in line with that lemon kind of yuzu bitterness to it, because it is very present, especially as it does cool down. It very much has a little bit more of the bitter side of a lemon than opposed to like a sweeter side of it. Berry fruit, level 3, that's the grape, which it's definitely on the lower side of things, but it's pronounced. I can taste it, so I feel like it kind of justified that in a cup that maybe wasn't the most flavorful thing to begin with. And saltiness, level 3, again, that kind of goes in line with the lemon. But we'll discuss that last thing, which is that sweetness at a level 3, and that's really the sticking point for me on this coffee. But I have to say that that is the case with Typica coffees as a whole. That's the variety with this coffee. Oftentimes I have a very hard time getting a lot more of the sweetness from that variety, so I don't think I was overly surprised by that. I think maybe my expectations for the coffee were that it was going to skew more on the sweet side of things, but not necessarily the case for me. I really like the way that this tasting wheel looks, though. I think it's a pretty nice representation of what we were experiencing. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I did have pretty high expectations going into this review, if I'm being completely honest, because Ecuador's had a wonderful season, and the reason Ecuador's had such a wonderful season year is because they've been on the sweeter side of coffees. So it's a little bit of a sticking point to me. I say this all the time, to have the acidity higher than the sweetness, and the acidity was definitely more pronounced than the sweetness in this cup, which is a little unfortunate. It's skewed towards a flavor profile that isn't necessarily my favorite, which again is that citric attribute, and maybe I was hoping for the sweeter side of the citrus again, as opposed to the more bitter tart side of citrus. And it really didn't necessarily stand out in one factor that I might have hoped for, just a little bit of kind of unique component with that gummy-like feel at times. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, though, somebody that does like a lot more of the citric attributes and maybe does like the sweetness a little bit more toned down, because I feel like having a bright citric acidity to a cup, while not necessarily having to focus on maybe a more candied sweetness, maybe a more bright sweetness that does take away from those more citric side of things, that's kind of the best fit. It is a clean coffee. It is a lighter profiled coffee. So all of those attributes kind of put together makes for what I would say is a coffee drinker that just typically tends to skew a little bit more in the citric acidic direction, which isn't necessarily me, but that kind of feels like the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Los Cedros wash processed Ecuador from Apollon's Gold. Thank you for watching.